In 1927, the Mississippi River destroyed a region the size of Belgium, and the bill rewrote American infrastructure forever. The Great Flood of 1927 wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a financial reckoning that exposed who actually owned the American South and who'd have to pay to rebuild it. By April, over 27,000 square miles lay underwater. Levees that cost millions to build collapsed in hours. And here's the trick: the money that flowed into recovery didn't go where you'd expect. Let's start with the cost. The Red Cross estimated damages at $236 million in 1927 dollars. That's roughly $4 billion today. Crop losses alone, cotton, rice, timber, wiped out an entire season of production across multiple states. But the real question isn't what the disaster cost, it's who was holding the check when the water receded. Here's where the forensics get interesting. The federal government had never done disaster relief at this scale before. There was no Federal Emergency Management Agency, no disaster fund, no precedent. President Herbert Hoover appointed Herbert Hoover, yes, himself, to coordinate the relief effort. And the structure he built tells you everything about who had power and who didn't. The Red Cross became the primary relief organization. But in this matters, the Red Cross didn't have enough cash on hand. They launched a national fundraising campaign. The goal, $5 million. They hit it in weeks. But here's the catch: that money came from donations, not government appropriations. Meaning the burden fell on voluntary charity, not public coffers. A private charity couldn't cover infrastructure. Levees cost serious money. Between 1928 and 1933, federal spending on flood control and levee reconstruction totaled around $150 million. That's taxpayer money, not Red Cross checks. So the pattern emerges. Immediate relief came from charity. Long-term rebuilding came from government, which meant debt, bonds, and public obligation. The flood hit sharecroppers and plantation owners very differently. Plantations had collateral. Banks refinanced their debt. The owners could wait out the recovery. Sharecroppers, mostly black farmers working land they didn't own, had no safety net. They lost a year's wages and had nowhere to borrow against future crops. This wasn't just a humanitarian gap, it was an economic fork in the road. So where did the recovery money actually flow? The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers got a mandate to redesign the entire levee system. Between 1927 and 1940, Congress funneled roughly $300 million into the Mississippi River Commission. That's the real infrastructure story. The disaster became the justification for federal control of a regional waterway. Here's the trick: the 1927 flood created a permanent precedent. Before the flood, levee maintenance was a local responsibility. After 1927, the federal government owned the problem. The Flood Control Act of 1928 made the government responsible for building and maintaining major levees. That shifted $300 million plus in long-term liability onto federal budgets. But the government didn't have that money sitting around. It borrowed. The Treasury issued bonds specifically to fund flood control. Those bonds had to be repaid with interest by future generations of taxpayers. The 1927 flood didn't just cost money once, it created a debt structure that lasted decades. The flood also reshaped agricultural credit. Banks had lost massive exposure on cotton loans. After 1927, federal agencies began creating crop insurance and credit programs to stabilize rural lending. The Federal Farm Board was expanded. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration followed in 1933. Each program meant more federal spending, more debt, more infrastructure. Insurance companies took a hit too. Property and crop insurance wasn't mature in 1927. Most farmers were uninsured. Insurance companies that did right policies faced massive claims. The industry tightened underwriting, raised premiums, and demanded better risk data. That made private insurance more expensive for Southern farmers, which pushed more of them toward government programs. The flood also accelerated mechanization. Landowners who could access capital after the disaster invested in tractors and equipment instead of hiring sharecroppers. Labor-saving machinery meant fewer workers needed. The economics of Southern agriculture shifted permanently. The flood didn't just destroy crops, it destroyed a labor model. Now let's trace the money through reconstruction contracts. Construction companies, steel mills, timber suppliers, and equipment manufacturers all benefited from the $300 million in federal spending. The flood wasn't equally distributed. It concentrated wealth among businesses that could scale up to handle government contracts. Regional inequality deepened. Real estate values shifted dramatically. Land in the floodplain became cheaper but riskier. Investors who bought at discount and held through the recovery period made significant gains as levees improved and confidence returned. Those without capital to buy at the trough couldn't participate in the recovery profit. The flood also changed how America thought about public infrastructure as a federal responsibility. Before 1927, roads, dams, and utilities were mostly private or local. After 1927, the government owned the narrative. Large-scale infrastructure required federal backing. That mindset enabled the New Deal, the interstate highway system, and modern public works. The Treasury's borrowing for flood control also had inflation effects. More government debt meant more money in circulation. The 1920s were already an era of speculative excess. Federal flood spending added liquidity to an already inflated market. Some economists argue this contributed to the bubble that burst in 1929. Here's the final accounting. The 1927 Mississippi flood cost roughly $236 million in direct damages. But the indirect costs of long-term infrastructure spending, debt service, policy changes, labor displacement likely exceeded $1 billion over the following decade. The visible disaster was water. The invisible disaster was fiscal. So when you ask who paid for the 1927 flood, the answer is everyone, but not equally. Sharecroppers lost everything and got charity. Plantation owners got loans and recovery. Construction companies got contracts. Taxpayers got debt. And America got a new model: federal infrastructure spending as a permanent feature of governance. The water receded. The policy remained. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe for more forensic dives into how disasters, crises, and forgotten events actually restructured money, power, and policy. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.